A man rode out to collect a debt. He came back with something no amount of money could ever buy, and made an enemy who would burn his world to the ground. If you've ever watched someone choose a stranger over their own blood, you know there are moments in life that split a person clean in two: the person they were before and whoever they become after. This is one of those stories. Stay until the end and drop your city in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels. The horse smelled the rot before Coulter Hayes did. Buck, a gray quarter horse with 17 years of bad weather written into his joints, slowed without being asked, ears pinned flat against his skull, nostrils working the hot desert air like he was trying to identify something he'd rather not find. Coulter let him slow. He'd learned long ago that Buck's instincts were sharper than his own, and sharper than any man's he'd ever hired. He shifted his weight in the saddle and looked out across the canyon floor. Red Canyon sat about 4 miles east of his ranch boundary, carved by an ancient river that had long since given up and disappeared into the Arizona rock. The walls were deep ochre in the morning light, streaked with rust and shadow, and the land at the bottom was flat and cracked and absolutely useless for anything except making a man feel small. Edwin Mercer had built his shack down here 11 years ago, after his first wife left him, and took his decent plot of land along with her. The shack had never been much: 2 rooms, a leaning porch, a well that tasted like iron. But 11 years of neglect and something worse, something deliberate, like a man punishing the walls around him for the failures inside him, had turned it into something that barely qualified as shelter. Coulter clicked his tongue and Buck moved again, reluctant, picking his way down the canyon path with the careful mistrust of an animal that understood suffering when it got close. The debt itself was simple enough. 3 years ago, during a bad winter, Edwin Mercer had come to Iron Mesa Ranch with his hat in his hand, and a story Coulter had heard a dozen times in a dozen different versions from a dozen different men. Cattle dead. Well frozen. Couldn't make it to spring without a loan. He'd needed $40 and a promise of seed grain come March. Coulter had given it to him because that was what a man did. He had not expected it back quickly. He was not a banker. He did not charge interest. But $40 was $40, and 3 years was 3 years. And the twice-a-year messages he'd sent through town had come back with nothing but excuses folded inside them. Too dry this season. Lost 2 horses. Come back in the fall. He was done coming back in the fall. He rode a buck to the hitching post, a single weathered plank nailed between 2 dead mesquite stumps, and dismounted slowly, rolling the stiffness out of his left knee. The knee was an old story. Cattle incident, badly set bone. He'd gotten used to the grinding, the way cold mornings made it sound like someone stepping on gravel, but he never got used to people watching him walk with that slight hitch and deciding it meant something about him. He tied Buck and stood for a moment, reading the yard. The shack's front door was open, which meant either Edwin was awake or Edwin hadn't come home. 2 chickens scratched in the dirt near the porch, thin birds with patchy feathers, and the joyless expression of animals that had forgotten there was any other kind of life. A rusted plow sat against the shack's east wall, obviously unused for years. The garden plot beside the porch was a mess of dead vines and cracked earth, with a few scraggly bean plants pushing up through it, less growing than surviving, which Coulter thought was an honest description of most things in Red Canyon. He stepped up onto the porch. The boards groaned under him. Not the normal complaint of old wood, but something deeper. A sound like the structure itself was questioning whether it wanted to hold a man's weight today. He knocked on the door frame. Mercer. Nothing from inside. Then a crash. Then a low sliding curse that turned into a cough. Mercer. It's Coulter Hayes. More movement. Something fell over. A bottle, from the sound of it, rolling across uneven floorboards. Then Edwin Mercer appeared in the doorway, and Coulter had to work to keep his face from showing what he was thinking. Edwin had been a big man once. You could still see it in the frame: wide shoulders, large hands, the skeleton of someone who'd once done real work with his body. But the flesh on that frame had gone wrong somewhere along the way. His face was puffy and red in the particular way of men who'd been drinking since before the sun was properly up. Broken capillaries mapping a decade of bad decisions across his nose and cheeks. His shirt was untucked and stained, and his eyes, when they finally focused on Coulter, had the watery, defensive quality of a man who knew exactly why you were there and had already decided not to be ashamed about it. Hayes. He leaned against the doorframe in a way that was supposed to look casual and instead looked necessary. Didn't know you were coming. Sent word 2 weeks ago. Must have missed it. You missed the last 4 too. Coulter kept his voice level. He wasn't here to fight. He was here to collect what was owed and go home. I need what I lent you, Edwin. 3 years is long enough. Edwin's expression shifted through something complicated. A brief flash of shame, then the defensive hardening that follows it in men who've decided shame is too expensive. He scratched the back of his neck and looked past Coulter at the empty canyon, like the answer might be written on the walls out there. Times are hard, Edwin said. They're hard for everyone. Not everyone loses 2 seasons of crops to the drought. No, Coulter said. Some of them figure out a way to work anyway. It wasn't kind. He hadn't meant it to be kind. But it also wasn't cruel, just honest, and Edwin Mercer had always known the difference between the two, even when he pretended not to. Edwin's jaw tightened. He pushed off the doorframe and moved back into the shack, gesturing vaguely for Coulter to follow. Coulter stepped inside. The interior was worse than the exterior. Dishes unwashed for what looked like days. Empty bottles pushed against the base of the wall with the resigned tidiness of someone who'd given up pretending they weren't there but still couldn't quite throw them out. A table with 2 chairs, one of which had a cracked leg propped up with a folded piece of leather. The air smelled like old food and sour sweat, and the particular metallic loneliness that settles into places where no one has laughed for a long time. I don't have the cash, Edwin said. He was standing at the table now with his back to Coulter, doing something with his hands that might have been looking through papers or might have been giving himself a moment to think. Straight truth of it. Then we talk about another arrangement. What kind of arrangement? You've got cattle? 4 head. They're half dead. Land? Edwin snorted. Canyon land. You want canyon land, Hayes? You're welcome to it. You'll get $40 worth of frustration and not a damn thing else. He turned around then, and there was something in his eyes that Coulter didn't quite like. A kind of calculating focus that seemed too sharp for a man who was supposed to be half drunk. Like he'd been thinking about this visit. Like he'd already made a decision before Coulter arrived. There's something else, Edwin said. Coulter waited. My girl. Edwin said it the way you'd say my wagon or my fence post. A possession, a variable in an equation. Clara. She's 19. She's strong. She's a hard worker. She can cook and she can sew and she's got her letters, which is more than most girls out here. You take her on at that ranch of yours and we call the debt square. The silence that followed was the kind that has weight. Coulter looked at Edwin Mercer for a long moment. He was aware of his own breathing, aware of the flies buzzing against the dirty window glass, aware of the particular stillness that falls over a room when something has been said that cannot be unsaid. You're offering me your daughter, Coulter said slowly, as payment for a debt. I'm offering you a worker, Edwin said, with the confidence of a man who has decided that the right word can change what a thing actually is. She'd be in your service, like an indentured arrangement. She'd work off the $40 plus what I figure interest would be, and she's not livestock, Edwin. I didn't say she was. The defensive snap came quick. I said she'd work, that's all. Girl needs to work somewhere, might as well be useful. And that was when Coulter heard it. A sound from the back of the shack. Small, careful, the sound of someone trying very hard not to make a sound. Like a person who had learned that being noticed was dangerous. He turned. There was a rough curtain hung across what he assumed was the back room, burlap and faded cotton stitched together in a way that had once tried to be something and given up. The curtain shifted slightly, and through the gap he caught a glimpse of a face. Young. Much younger than he'd somehow expected, though 19 was exactly what Edwin had said. Dark eyes. A sharpness in them that you only get from watching people closely for a very long time because you have to, not because you want to. Her hair was dark and pulled back and not quite neat, the way a person looks when they're keeping themselves together through effort rather than ease. And then Edwin turned toward the curtain and said, flatly, like calling a dog, Clara, get out here. The curtain moved and she came through. She was thin. Not the thinness of a girl who hasn't filled out yet, but the thinness of someone who doesn't always eat enough. The kind that shows in the wrists, in the particular way the collarbones stand too prominent above the neckline of a worn dress. She was wearing a blue dress that had been washed so many times the color had retreated to a kind of memory, visible only in the shadows of the fabric. She was barefoot, which struck Coulter as wrong, somehow. Not shameful on her part, but wrong on the part of everything around her. She looked at Coulter. Not at her father. At Coulter, directly, steadily, the way frightened people sometimes do when they're trying to figure out quickly whether someone is safe. He didn't look away. "Tell Mr. Hayes you're a hard worker," Edwin said. Clara's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. She looked at her father then, briefly, and whatever passed through her face in that moment was complicated and old. "I'm a hard worker," she said. Her voice was low and even and carried the careful flatness of someone who has learned to drain their words of anything that could be used against them. "She's a good girl," Edwin said to Coulter, like he was explaining the merits of a horse. "Kept this place running. Does more than her share. You put her to work on that ranch of yours and you won't be sorry." "Mr. Mercer." Coulter's voice came out harder than he'd intended. "I'm not here to buy anyone." "It's not buying," Edwin started, and the irritation in his voice was climbing now, the drunk man's irritation that comes when reality refuses to cooperate with the story he's constructed. "It's a labor arrangement. I'm telling you, the girl needs—" "I don't want to go," Clara said it quietly, looking at the floor, not at either of them. The room went very still. Edwin turned to his daughter with a look that Coulter recognized from his worst memories of his worst neighbors. A look that had very little to do with the situation at hand and everything to do with the humiliation of being contradicted by someone you'd decided had no right to contradict you. "What did you say?" Edwin said. Clara kept her eyes on the floor. "I said I don't want to go. I want to stay here. This is my home." "Your home." The words came out coated in something ugly. "Your home that I built and paid for and kept over your head for 19 years while you—" "Edwin!" Coulter's voice was flat, warning, but Edwin was past listening. He crossed the room in 3 strides, and Coulter saw it coming a half second before it happened. That particular shift in a man's shoulder, the weight transfer, the way a coward builds momentum because he knows exactly what he's about to do and has decided to commit to it quickly, so he doesn't have time to feel bad about it. The slap cracked across Clara's cheek and snapped her head sideways. She didn't cry out. She didn't fall. She just stood there with her face turned to the side and her eyes closed, and the fact that she didn't even flinch, the absolute lack of surprise in her body, was the thing that broke something loose in Coulter Hayes. He had Edwin Mercer's shirt in his fist before he'd made a conscious decision to move. I was not a violent man by nature. He'd lived 41 years in rough country and had thrown exactly 3 punches in his adult life. Each one, after considerable patience, had run out. But he moved Edwin backward into the wall with enough force to rattle the whole shack, and he put his face close enough that Edwin could smell the trail dust on him, and he said very quietly, "You do that again, and I will take the dead out of your hide. Are we clear?" It wasn't a question. Edwin, for all his bluster, was the kind of man whose courage lived entirely in the absence of consequences. Pressed against his own wall by someone who outweighed him by 30 pounds, and clearly meant every word, he went very still and very sober, very fast. "Clear," Edwin muttered. Coulter let him go, stepped back, smoothed the front of his own jacket with a deliberateness that had nothing to do with the jacket. Clara had turned back around during this. There was a red mark rising on her cheekbone, visible even in the dim light of the shack. She was looking at Coulter again with those dark, measuring eyes, and he could see her working through something, calculating, the way prey animals calculate when something unexpected happens in their environment, and they need to figure out whether it's better or worse than what came before. Coulter looked at her. Then he looked around the shack, the empty bottles, the cracked chair leg, the kitchen with its dirty dishes, and the thin curtain that separated a young woman's entire life from a drunk man's worst impulses. He thought about Buck outside waiting in the Arizona sun. He thought about his ranch, Iron Mesa, 40 miles of hard-won land with actual walls and actual food, and people who, rough as some of them were, operated by a code. He thought about his daughter Lily, 8 years old and still sleeping with a candle lit because she'd been afraid of the dark since her mother died, and who had been asking for months when they were going to get someone to help with the cooking now that Rosa's back was going bad. He thought, for half a second, about all the ways this could go badly. Then he thought about riding away from this shack and leaving Clara Mercer standing in it, and he couldn't quite make that thought complete. "Miss Mercer," he said. She looked up at him. "I'm not buying you. I want to be clear about that. No man has a right to sell his daughter, and I'm not in the business of pretending otherwise." He kept his voice steady, addressing her directly, not looking at Edwin at all. but I have a working ranch that needs help, and I can offer you a legal contract. 5 years of service, properly written, witnessed at the county clerk. Wage and room and board, full protection, and at the end of 5 years you walk away free with enough saved to make your own start. Everything spelled out on paper. Clara stared at him. Something moved through her expression that he couldn't quite read. That's just another way of... Edwin started. I'm talking to your daughter, Coulter said without turning. Not you. Clara's eyes moved to her father, then to the shack around them, then back to Coulter, and in her look was something he recognized from the mirror on mornings when the ranch was bleeding money and the cattle were sick, and he had to decide between two bad options and pick the least bad one. I'd have my own room? She asked. Yes. You wouldn't. I mean, you'd leave me alone, at night. It cost her something to ask that. He could see it. He answered without flinching. You have my word. You're there to work. Nothing else is asked of you. She was quiet for a moment. Outside, one of the thin chickens made a hopeless sound. Can I bring my books? Clara asked. It was such a small question, such a particular, human, unexpected small question that Coulter almost didn't know what to do with it for a second. You can bring whatever fits in a saddlebag, he said. She nodded, slowly, with the careful deliberateness of someone making a decision they know they can't take back. All right, Clara said, I'll go. Edwin made a sound that was somewhere between relief and resentment, which was probably the most honest combination of feelings he'd had in years. He started talking about the terms, about how this made them square, about how she'd better behave herself and not embarrass him. Edwin. Coulter turned to face him fully now, and whatever was in his face made Edwin stop talking. When we get to town and file this contract, you sign over your claim to her labor, and that's the end of your involvement. She's under my protection starting this moment. If I hear you've come to my land looking to renegotiate or reclaim or anything else, he let it sit there, unfinished. Don't test what I mean by that. Edwin said nothing. Coulter walked to the door. He stopped at the threshold and looked back at Clara, who was already moving toward the back curtain, to pack, presumably, to gather whatever of her life fit into a saddlebag. Take your time, he said. We're not in a rush. It was a lie, but it was the right kind of lie. The kind you tell someone to give them the dignity of not being hurried. I went out to stand with Buck in the Arizona sun, listening to the canyon silence, and tried to figure out exactly what he'd just agreed to. Behind him, through the thin walls of the shack, he heard Clara moving carefully, quietly, like someone who'd spent years learning how to exist without taking up space. He'd done something today that he hadn't planned, something that would complicate his life considerably, something that 3 of his ranch hands would think was foolish, and one would think was worse than foolish. He didn't know Clara Mercer, didn't know her temperament or her habits, or whether she was honest, or whether she'd be any kind of fit for the work that needed doing at Iron Mesa. He knew almost nothing except the mark on her cheek and the way she'd asked about her books. But when she came out of that shack 20 minutes later, small bundle tucked under her arm, 3 books wrapped in a piece of cloth held against her chest like something fragile and worth protecting, face composed into careful blankness, she walked to Buck without being told, and waited with a kind of patience that had clearly been forced upon her by years of having no other option. Coulter helped her up onto the horse without comment. They rode out of Red Canyon in silence. The sun was already harsh overhead, flattening the desert scrub, burning the smell of dry sage and hot rock into the air. Clara rode behind him, one hand on the saddle, not touching him, keeping her balance with the unconscious competence of a girl who'd grown up around horses even if she hadn't often been allowed to ride them. After about a mile, she spoke. Mr. Hayes. Yeah. Why'd you do that? You could have just taken the deal he was offering. Most men would have. It was a real question, not naive. She wanted the real answer, and she'd calculated correctly that asking it directly was the fastest way to get it. Coulter considered it honestly. Because most things that look like the easy deal aren't. She was quiet for another minute. That's not the whole reason. No, he agreed. It's not. She didn't push further. Maybe she'd decide later whether to believe whatever answer she eventually assembled for herself. Maybe she'd wait and watch, and let his actions make the argument. That struck him, actually, the restraint of it. Most people, frightened people especially, either talked too much or went completely silent. She'd ask the important question and then let it be. He clicked his tongue at Buck, and they rode on into the wide, indifferent Arizona afternoon, the canyon falling away behind them, and the desert stretching ahead in every direction like a problem that didn't have a solution yet, just a direction. Clara Mercer clutched her books against her chest and did not look back at Red Canyon. She was 19 years old, riding toward a stranger's ranch on the strength of a spoken promise. She had absolutely no reason to trust it, but she'd learned something in 19 years of watching people closely, out of pure necessity, the way you learn to read weather when weather can ruin you. She'd looked at Coulter Hayes when he grabbed her father's shirt, and she'd watched his face in that moment. Not angry, exactly. Something quieter and colder than anger. Something that looked, strangely, like a principle being enforced. She hadn't seen many of those. Maybe that was enough to ride toward. Maybe it wasn't. The desert didn't offer opinions either way. They arrived at Iron Mesa Ranch as the sun began its long, slow collapse behind the western ridgeline, painting the sky in colors Clara had no names for. Some overlap of orange and rose and a deep bruised purple that seemed almost angry at the coming dark. The ranch materialized out of the flat heat shimmer, like something she'd half expected to be imaginary. Real walls, a real gate, a cook fire smell on the evening air. Men moving at the end of their workday. A dog barking. Somewhere inside, a child's voice asking something too far away to make out. Clara straightened her spine. She would not arrive at this place looking like she'd already been beaten. She'd had enough of that. The dog was the first one to decide about her. It was a big, ugly cattle dog named Soot, black and gray with one torn ear and the permanent expression of an animal that had seen too much foolishness from too many people and had stopped being polite about it. He met Clara at the gate the evening she arrived, planted himself in front of her like a checkpoint, and spent a full 30 seconds just smelling her boots while she stood very still and let him. Then he sneezed, walked beside her the rest of the way to the porch, and never questioned her presence again. Clara decided that was a reasonable standard to hold the rest of the ranch to. The humans took longer. Coulter brought her inside and introduced her to Rosa Vega first, which was either instinct or strategy, probably both. Rosa was the ranch cook, somewhere between 50 and 60, with thick gray streaked hair pinned back from a face that had the particular quality of someone who had laughed and cried equally hard over the course of her life, and was not trying to hide either. She was stirring something on the iron stove when they came in, and she turned and looked at Clara, the way a person looks at something they weren't expecting but are immediately willing to figure out. "This is Clara Mercer," Coulter said. "She'll be helping with the house, and the cooking, and whatever else needs doing." Rosa put down her spoon. She crossed the kitchen in 3 steps and took Clara's face gently in both hands. Not to examine the bruise, though she clearly saw it. Just looking at her the way older women sometimes look at younger ones when they recognize something that doesn't need to be named out loud. "You hungry?" Rosa said. "Yes, ma'am," Clara said. "Then sit down." Rosa was already turning back to the stove. "The men can wait." That was the full extent of her welcome, and it was more than enough. Coulter showed Clara the room that would be hers, small, off the back of the main house, with a narrow bed and a washstand and a window that looked out over the east pasture. It smelled like dust and cedar, and something faintly floral from a dried bundle of lavender hung over the window. The latch on the door worked from the inside. She checked it twice without meaning to, running her thumb over the iron mechanism, and when she looked up, Coulter was watching her with no expression at all, which meant he understood exactly what she was checking and had already decided not to comment on it. "The latch is solid," he said. "Had it fixed last spring." She nodded and set her bundle on the bed. He left her alone. She sat on the edge of the mattress for a long moment in the last gray light coming through the east window, her 3 books in her lap, and she listened to the sounds of the ranch settling into evening. The distant low of cattle, men's voices from the bunkhouse going quiet, the clink of Rosa's kitchen work, somewhere the creak of a porch board under someone's weight. All of it ordinary and distant and entirely indifferent to her. That was fine. Indifference she could work with. Indifference was not dangerous. She lay down on top of the covers without undressing, and she was asleep before she'd finished deciding whether to be. She didn't dream about her father's shack. She didn't dream about the canyon. In the morning she woke up to someone staring at her from the doorway. It was a child. 8 years old. Small-framed, with Coulter's dark coloring but a face that was still soft with the roundness of childhood, wearing a cotton nightdress and holding a stuffed rabbit by one ear. She was staring at Clara with an expression of pure, unguarded curiosity. Not rude, just direct in the way children are before they learn that staring is considered impolite. Clara looked back at her for a moment. "You're Clara," the child said. "Yes. Papa said you were coming. I'm Lily." She paused. "Are you going to stay?" "That's the plan," Clara said. Lily considered this with the solemnity of someone making a real assessment. "Are you scared?" The question landed oddly. Clara pushed herself up onto her elbows. "Of what?" "Of the ranch. Some people come and then leave because it's too hard." Lily hugged the rabbit against her chest. "Marta left. She was here to help before. She lasted 2 months and then she left, and Papa was in a bad mood for a long time." "How long ago was that?" "Before the last winter." Clara looked at this child standing barefoot in a doorway at sunrise holding a rabbit with dark circles under her eyes that had no business being on an 8-year-old's face. "I'm not scared," she said, "and I'm not planning to leave." Lily seemed to file this away somewhere. "Do you know how to make biscuits?" "I do." "Rosa's biscuits are good, but she burns the bottom sometimes. She says it's the stove's fault." "It might be the stove's fault," Clara said. "That's what Rosa says, too." A pause. "Will you come to breakfast?" Clara got up and straightened her dress and combed her hair as best she could without a proper mirror, and she followed Coulter's 8-year-old daughter to the kitchen, and that was more or less how her life at Iron Mesa Ranch began. It was not smooth. Nothing about it was smooth. The ranch ran on a schedule built for men who'd been there for years, with rhythms and shorthand and unspoken divisions of labor that Clara spent the first week simply mapping. Rosa explained some of it, Lily explained more, and the rest she figured out by watching and occasionally by making mistakes that announced themselves loudly. There were 6 ranch hands in permanent employ. 2 of them, Miguel and an older hand named Carver, gave her approximately the same treatment as Soot had at the gate, assessed her, found her acceptable, moved on. 2 others were simply indifferent in the way busy men are when someone new enters their peripheral vision but doesn't directly affect their work. A 5th man, Pete Dobbs, was friendly in a way that felt practiced and careful, the kind of friendly that you put on because you're trying to decide something and don't want anyone to notice. And the 6th, a younger hand named Dale Sutter, who was maybe 25 and had the particular confidence of men who've never been challenged in the right ways, looked at Clara on her first full day and said something to the man beside him that she didn't quite catch but didn't need to, because she recognized the shape of it from tone and posture alone. She said nothing. She had learned long before that responding to that particular kind of comment only escalated it. She kept her head down and learned the kitchen and learned the garden and watched. Lily attached herself within the first 3 days with the determined single-mindedness of a child who has identified something she needs and has decided not to let it get away. She followed Clara through the kitchen, through the garden, out to the well and back, asking a continuous low-level stream of questions about everything, about the names of plants, about why bread had to rise before it baked, about what Red Canyon looked like, about whether Clara had ever been to Tucson, about whether the rabbit, named Captain, she eventually learned, was a good name for a rabbit or too serious. "I think it's a fine name," Clara told her, on the 3rd evening, sitting on the back porch shelling beans with Lily pressed against her side like the child was cold, though the evening was warm. "Suits him." "Papa said I could name him whatever I wanted." Lily turned Captain over in her lap thoughtfully. "I wanted something important sounding, because he's important." "That's good thinking." Lily leaned her head slightly against Clara's arm. Clara noticed and kept shelling beans and said nothing about it. The thing about Lily was that she was not a difficult child. She was a lonely child, which looked similar from the outside but was entirely different on the inside. She had her father's self-containment, that quality of not demanding things out loud, of waiting quietly and accepting whatever came, and it made her seem older than 8 and also somehow more fragile, like she'd already taught herself not to expect too much, and was still in the process of deciding whether that had been worth learning. Clara started reading to her at night. It wasn't planned. It began because Clara mentioned the books she'd brought, and Lily asked to see them, and one thing led to another in the natural way that things do with children when you're not careful. By the 2nd week it was a routine. After supper, before Lily's bedtime, Clara would read aloud while Lily sat cross-legged on the bed, with Captain in her lap. They were working through a book of frontier history that Clara had, which Lily found thrilling in ways that occasionally had to be tempered. Did people really fight like that? Lily asked once, eyes wide. Sometimes. Was it? Lily paused, working out her question. Was it brave, or was it just stupid? Clara thought about that honestly. Usually some of both, she said. That's most things that get called brave. Lily considered this for a while and then nodded like it confirmed something she'd suspected. Coulter watched all of this from a distance that was respectful but not disinterested. Clara noticed him noticing, the way he'd come in from the range at the end of the day and pause in the kitchen doorway when Lily was helping her with something, just for a second, just long enough to see his daughter's face, and then move on without comment. He had the quality of a man who kept most of his responses internal, which Clara understood because she had that quality herself, except hers had been built from necessity, and she wasn't sure his had. They spoke functionally, work things, schedule things. He was not unfriendly. He was not warm, exactly. He was present, in a way that was different from absent and different from hovering, and she wasn't sure what to call it. Roughly 3 weeks in, she burned an entire batch of preserves she'd been making from the last of the summer peaches. She burned them badly, left them on the stove when Lily had scraped her knee in the garden and she'd gone out without thinking, and by the time she got back, the kitchen smelled like scorched sugar and regret. She stood at the stove and looked at the ruined pot and felt the hot, specific frustration of someone who takes their own competence seriously and has just failed in front of a place they're trying to prove themselves in. She was scrubbing the pot in the yard, aggressively, with the kind of elbow grease you apply when you're really scrubbing at something internal. When Coulter came around the corner of the house and stopped, he looked at the pot. He looked at her. Preserves? Yes, she said. I know. I'll remake them. The peaches are gone. I know that too. She kept scrubbing. I'll find something else to put up. I'll figure it out. I was quiet for a moment. Rosa burned the same batch 2 years running, he said. The kitchen stove runs hot on the left side. She keeps meaning to have it looked at. Clara stopped scrubbing and looked up at him. He wasn't smiling, exactly, but there was something at the edge of his expression that was adjacent to it. Might not be entirely your fault, is all I'm saying. I left it unattended. Yeah, he said, but the stove didn't help. He walked on toward the barn without waiting for her response, which was both annoying and, she admitted to herself, somewhat decent of him. The trouble with Dale Sutter announced itself on a Saturday at the end of her 4th week, in the way problems like that usually do, publicly, casually, as if the person causing them doesn't fully understand that they're doing anything notable. Clara had been drawing water at the yard well when Dale came out of the barn with 2 other hands and said, loud enough to be clearly intentional, "Must be real convenient, Hayes, riding all the way to Red Canyon to pick up whatever took your fancy." The 2 other hands both found somewhere else to look. Clara put the bucket down on the well's edge and turned to face him. She was aware that her heart was doing something unpleasant. She was also aware that how she handled the next 20 seconds would determine, to some meaningful degree, how the rest of her time at this ranch would go. She'd been around enough men like Dale Sutter to know that showing fear was the worst thing you could do, and showing anger was the second worst. "I work here," she said. "Same as you." "Sure you do." The smile on Dale's face was the kind that knows exactly how it looks, and considers that an asset. "Seems like interesting work, though." "The cooking and the garden and the laundry," Clara said. "Fascinating stuff. You ought to try it sometime, see if it suits you." One of the other hands made a sound that might have been a suppressed laugh. Dale's smile went a little fixed. He took a step toward her and she held her ground, bucket handle in her hand, and she met his eyes with the particular steadiness of someone who has had worse than this in a room with no witnesses and survived it fine. She didn't see Coulter until he was already there. He'd come from somewhere behind the barn. She hadn't heard him approach, and apparently neither had Dale, because Dale's face changed considerably when he registered Coulter standing 6 feet away with a look that was very quiet and very specific. "Dale," Coulter said. Just that. One word. Dale turned. "Boss." "Just talking." "I heard you talking." Coulter looked at him for a moment that stretched uncomfortably. "That's not how we talk to people here. If I hear it again, you can find yourself another outfit." Dale's jaw moved. I know what you were just." Coulter turned away from him, which was its own kind of statement. The dismissal of someone who doesn't warrant further argument. He picked up Clara's full bucket from the well edge. "I'll carry this in." Clara fell into step beside him. Behind them, Dale Sutter was very quiet. They walked to the house without speaking for a moment. Then Coulter said, You handled that well. You didn't need to step in, she said. I had it. I know you did. He said it without any particular inflection. Didn't step in for your sake. Stepped in because he's been pushing boundaries for 2 months, and that was the one that needed addressing in front of witnesses. She looked at the side of his face. There was something she wanted to say, and wasn't sure how to shape yet. She settled on, he won't let it go. No, Coulter agreed. Men like that don't, but they get quieter when they know there's a cost to it. He set the bucket by the kitchen door. He won't touch you, that I can promise. It was a practical statement, not a romantic one, and she appreciated it more for that. She went inside. What she didn't say, what she turned over quietly in her own mind for the rest of that afternoon while she made bread, and Lily sat at the table drawing pictures of Captain in various heroic poses, was that she believed him. Not because she was naive, not because she'd decided Coulter Hayes was something other than a complicated man with his own interests and his own weight to carry, but because in 4 weeks she'd watched him operate, and she'd noticed something consistent. He said what he meant, and he did what he said. Quietly, without ceremony, without requiring anyone to thank him for it. There was no performance in it. She'd grown up in a house full of performance. She knew the difference. Lily pushed her drawing across the table without looking up. What do you think? I gave him a sword. Clara looked at the drawing. Captain the Rabbit, rendered with considerable enthusiasm, if not technical precision, holding what was either a sword or a large carrot. Inspired, she said. What's he fighting? Bandits, Lily said very seriously. He protects the ranch. Clara looked at the drawing for another moment and thought, for reasons she couldn't have fully articulated, that this kitchen, this child, this ordinary afternoon, was something she needed to be careful with. Not because it was bad, but because it was the kind of thing you could start to count on, and she wasn't sure yet that she had the right to do that. Rosa came in from the garden then, dusting her hands on her apron, and announced that the last squash were coming in and someone needed to deal with them before the night's heat finished them off. And the afternoon moved forward the way afternoons do when there's work to be done and people to do it. But Clara carried that quiet feeling with her like something tucked into a pocket, uncertain whether it was hope or something that only looked like it. Both, probably. Same as most things worth keeping. The fever came on a Tuesday. Clara had felt it building for 2 days before it arrived fully. A slow, gathering heaviness behind her eyes. A fatigue that went deeper than the work could account for. She'd ignored it the way she ignored most things that inconvenienced her, which was to say completely and with considerable determination. There was too much to do. The fall preserving wasn't finished. Lily had started struggling with her letters and needed extra time. The ranch was moving into its autumn rhythms, and Rosa's back had been bad enough that Clara had quietly absorbed a third of her workload without anyone making a formal arrangement of it. She was standing on the kitchen stove on Tuesday morning when her vision went sideways. Not dramatically. Not the way it happens in stories where people collapse and wake up in clean beds with someone holding their hand. She simply reached for the coffee pot, and the room tilted about 15 degrees, and she had to grip the edge of the stove with both hands and wait for the world to decide which direction it actually was. Rosa was there in seconds. Sit down, she said, no argument in it. I'm fine. You are not fine. Sit down or I will make you sit down, and I'm heavier than I look. Rosa's hand was already on her forehead. Clara heard her make a sound, a short, specific sound, that was not reassuring. By noon she was in bed with a fever of 103 and the particular misery of someone who genuinely does not know how to be sick, because being sick had always previously been something she couldn't afford. She slept badly, woke badly, slept again. Rosa came in and out with water and broth. Lily stood in the doorway twice with Captain clutched against her chest, and an expression that Clara, in her half-conscious state, tried to find the energy to reassure but mostly couldn't. At some point late in the second night, the fever spiked. She was aware of it the way you're aware of weather. Not as something you're observing, but as something happening to you, inside you, a heat that seemed to come from the bones out. She kicked the blankets off, and then was cold and pulled them back, and then was burning again. Her throat was raw. The room kept doing something strange with its dimensions. She heard the door. Footsteps. Not Rosa's. Heavier, more deliberate. She turned her head toward the lamp on the bedside table, and Coulter Hayes was there, sitting in the chair he'd apparently pulled from the corner of the room, still in his day clothes with his hat off and his forearms resting on his knees, watching her with an expression she couldn't quite read in the dim light. "Where's Rosa?" she said. Her voice came out wrong, scraped sounding. "Asleep. It's past 2. He leaned forward and put the back of his hand against her forehead briefly, then pulled it back. "Fever's up?" "I know." She closed her eyes. "You don't need to sit here." "I know I don't." She waited for him to leave. He didn't. She opened her eyes again and looked at him. This man sitting in a chair in the small hours of the night, in a room that was not his, watching over someone he'd known for less than 2 months, and doing it with the quiet patience of a person who had decided this was where he needed to be and wasn't planning to justify it. "Lily's worried," she said. "Lily's asleep. She wore herself out worrying, and then she crashed around midnight." A pause. "She made me promise to sit with you. That's why you're here." He looked at her for a moment. "That's one reason," he said. Clara turned her face back toward the ceiling. The lamp cast long shadows, and the room was warm, and the fever made everything slightly unreal, which was maybe why she said what she said next, instead of keeping it properly filed away. "I haven't had anyone sit with me when I was sick since I was 7, she said. "My mother sat with me then, before she died." Coulter said nothing, but she heard him shift in the chair, settling in more firmly, like he was adjusting to stay rather than to leave. "You don't have to tell me things," he said quietly, "but I'll listen if you want to." She didn't say anything else, but she stopped fighting the blankets, and eventually the fever evened out somewhere around 3 in the morning, and she slept more heavily than she had in 2 days. When she woke at dawn, the chair was empty, but there was a fresh cup of water on the bedside table that hadn't been there before. She was mostly recovered by the end of the week, still tired in the way fevers leave you, a tiredness that lives in the deeper muscle layers and takes time to clear, but functional. Back in the kitchen by Friday, which Rosa protested and Clara ignored on the grounds that lying in bed when she could move was worse than working. "You're stubborn," Rosa told her. "Yes," Clara agreed and kept chopping onions. Something had shifted, though. She felt it without being able to fully name it, a difference in the quality of the air between her and Coulter. Not dramatic, not visible to anyone who wasn't paying close attention, but she was always paying close attention, and she noticed the way he made sure she had a cup of coffee before she'd thought to make one. The way he lingered a few extra minutes at the dinner table on the evenings she sat there with Lily after the meal. The way when she looked up quickly, she sometimes caught him looking at her with an expression that he didn't have time to fully put away before she saw it. She filed all of this carefully and said nothing, and tried to figure out what to do with it. The problem was simple and not simple at all: the contract. 5 years, written, witnessed, filed at the county clerk's office. She was employed. She was, in the most technical sense, still obligated. And she had learned too well what it meant to be in a situation where someone with power over you decided to interpret that power broadly. She was not going to let herself slide from one version of that into another, however different it felt on the surface. She told herself this on a cold October morning while splitting kindling in the backyard, told it to herself firmly and practically, and then Coulter came around the corner of the house and said, "You don't have to do that. Carver handles the wood." And she said, "Carver's fixing the east fence and I needed to be outside." And he looked at her for a second with that expression that was both there and not there, and said, "Fair enough," and walked on. She hit the next piece of kindling harder than necessary. The evening Victor Crow came to Iron Mesa, she was reading to Lily. She heard the horses first, 2 of them, moving up the main road at a pace that was more arrival than approach, the kind of entrance made by someone who considers arriving a performance. She heard the voices in the front room, too low to make out words, and then Lily said, "Who's that?" And Clara said, "I don't know, keep reading." And Lily kept reading aloud while Clara sat with the strange, sourceless tension of a body that has learned to notice certain vibrations in the air. She found out at dinner. Coulter told her that night in the kitchen, after Lily was in bed and Rosa had gone home to her quarters and the house was quiet. He stood in the kitchen doorway with his hat in his hands, turning it slowly, and he told her about Victor Crow, a merchant out of Tucson, wealthy in the way men become wealthy when they're not particular about how, who'd arrived with Edwin Mercer sitting beside him on the wagon bench like a piece of luggage that had acquired opinions. He told her what Victor wanted. He said it plainly, without softening it, because he'd apparently decided she deserved the plain version. Victor Crow wanted to purchase her contract, wanted to marry her, had arrived with Edwin's blessing and what he clearly considered an irresistible sum of money, and had spent 20 minutes in Coulter's front room explaining the arrangement with the patient confidence of a man who has never been told no by anyone he considered worth listening to. Clara stood at the kitchen counter with both hands flat on the surface and looked at the far wall. "What did you say?" she said. "I told him I'd think on it." At her look, he added, "I needed to talk to you first. It's my contract, it's my life." "Yes," he said. "That's why I needed to talk to you first." She looked at him. He looked back. The lamp between them threw his face into relief. Tired lines. The jaw she'd come to know as a kind of barometer of what he was actually thinking versus what he was saying. Right now it said he didn't like any part of this situation and was waiting. "I don't know this man," Clara said. "I know enough about him." "And?" Coulter set his hat down on the table. "He's not a man who sees people. He sees inventory." The word landed in the room and stayed there. "He came with my father," she said. It wasn't a question. "Yes." She was quiet for a long moment. Outside, the October wind moved against the house walls, finding the gaps, making the familiar sounds of a structure talking to the weather. "What does my father get out of it?" "Crow's paying him a finder's fee," Coulter said, "and settling whatever other debts he's got in the county." Clara absorbed this. She thought about Edwin Mercer, thought about him clearly, and without the distortion of either old pain or false forgiveness, and decided she wasn't surprised. Some people were consistently themselves. You had to give them that. "Tell me the number," she said. Coulter told her. She didn't react to it because it didn't matter. Numbers didn't change the shape of what was being offered. "I want to meet him," she said. "Clara, I want to look at him and tell him myself." She turned to face Coulter fully. "That's what I want. Can I have that?" He looked at her for a long moment. Something moved through his face, complicated and private. Then, "He'll be back tomorrow. He's staying at the Pharaoh's place in town tonight. Then I'll be ready in the morning." She went to her room and sat on the edge of her bed and pressed her hands together between her knees and sat with the specific feeling of a person who has been reminded, suddenly and without warning, that the world they've been cautiously building is not quite solid yet, but underneath that. And she noticed it and was careful with it, like you're careful with something fragile, was something else. Something that had nothing to do with Victor Crow and everything to do with what Coulter had said. "I needed to talk to you first." She turned it over carefully, held it up to what she knew of him, decided it meant what she thought it meant, put it away for now. Victor Crow arrived the next morning at 10. It was not what she'd pictured. She'd imagined someone larger, rougher, more obviously threatening. Instead, he was a compact man in his mid-40s, well-dressed in a way that wanted you to notice, with a gray-shot beard trimmed close and light eyes that moved quickly and assessed constantly. The eyes of a man conducting ongoing mental arithmetic. He was polite. He shook her hand like she was a business partner and smiled like he'd practiced it in a mirror enough times to almost make it convincing. Edwin sat behind him on the porch steps and did not look at his daughter. Victor explained his proposal with the smooth, reasonable language of a man who decided in advance that all potential objections were simply misunderstandings to be clarified. He would purchase the contract. He would take Clara to Tucson. She would have a comfortable house, good food, fine clothes. He was a practical man looking for a capable woman to manage a practical household. He did not use the word wife often. He used words like arrangement and position and opportunity. Clara stood on the porch of Iron Mesa Ranch in the October morning and let him finish talking. She was aware of Coulter behind her to her right, standing with his arms at his sides, not intervening, letting her have this. When Victor stopped talking, Clara said, "No." Victor's smile adjusted. "I don't think you fully understand what—" "I understand exactly what you're offering," she said, "and I'm telling you no. I'm not for sale. I wasn't for sale when my father tried it the first time, and I'm not for sale now." Victor's eyes went briefly to Edwin, then back to Clara. The politeness in his face thinned at the edges. "Miss Mercer, I think if you took some time to consider the practical realities of your situation—" "My situation," Clara said, "is that I have a legal contract with Iron Mesa Ranch that I intend to honor, a room with a latch that works, and a child who needs me to read to her tonight. That's my situation. Your offer doesn't improve it." Coulter said nothing, but from the corner of her eye she saw something change in his posture. Victor Crow looked at her for a moment with the flat assessment of a man who has just been told the price isn't right and is deciding whether to negotiate or leave. He decided to leave. The warmth came off his face like it was something he'd set down. You're making a mistake, he said, addressed to Clara, but his eyes moved to Coulter when he said it. If I am, she said, it's mine to make. Victor looked at Edwin then, briefly, with an expression that reassigned blame efficiently. Edwin stared at the ground. Victor turned, walked to his horse, mounted, and rode out of the yard at the same performance pace he'd arrived with. Edwin got up from the porch steps slowly. He looked at Clara finally, and his face was doing something complicated. The defensive architecture of a man who knows he's done wrong and has decided that knowing is enough, that acknowledging it is somehow too much to ask. You didn't need to, he started. Goodbye, Papa, Clara said. Edwin closed his mouth. He looked at her for another moment, and she stood there and let him look. And she did not give him the tears or the anger or the grief he may have been expecting, because she'd spent those already over years of smaller goodbyes and had nothing left for this one except clarity. He walked to his horse and rode away. Coulter came to stand beside her. He didn't say anything right away. They watched the road until both figures were dust and then just rode. You all right? He said. Yes. A pause. That was, you didn't waver. I've had practice, she said, knowing what I don't want. She felt him look at her sideways but didn't return the look. The morning was cold and clear, the kind of Arizona October morning that was almost gentle, the sun doing its work without the brutality of summer. The yard was quiet. Soot was lying in a patch of sunlight by the barn door, unconcerned with everything that had just happened, as dogs are. That night, she couldn't sleep. She lay in bed and stared at the ceiling and listened to the ranch breathe and thought about Victor Crow's eyes and her father's face, and the particular freedom of saying no to something out loud in daylight in front of witnesses. She'd said no before, quietly, privately, in ways that cost her and went unrecorded. This had been different. This had been standing on solid ground and saying it like she meant it, and meaning it. She thought eventually about Coulter, about the chair in the corner of her room at 2 a.m, about, I needed to talk to you first, about the way he'd stood behind her this morning at exactly the right distance, present but not in front of her, support without override. She thought about the contract, about the 4 years still remaining on it, about the wall that represented honest and solid, and why he'd built it himself by making it legal and written and witnessed in the first place. She thought about all the reasons this was complicated, and all the reasons she'd learned not to trust the things that felt like safety before she'd verified them. Then the wind came up outside, sudden and hard, and she heard something else, a crack from the direction of the barn, and a dog barking, and then a sound that took her brain one long, awful second to identify. She was at the window before she'd decided to move. The barn was on fire, not the slow, discovering kind of fire, the already burning kind. Flames were visible through the barn's upper vents and from under the main door, orange and vicious and moving with the wind's help, spreading across the old dry wood the way fire does when it has been encouraged. She was out of her room and into the hall, and at Coulter's door and knocking hard before she'd put shoes on. Fire, she said. The barn. She heard him move, the specific, immediate movement of someone who doesn't waste time between waking and acting. And then she was already running for the yard. What happened in the next 2 hours was chaos assembled loosely around a purpose. Men coming from the bunkhouse. Buckets. The well. Coulter in the middle of it, directing, his voice carrying across the yard not by volume but by certainty, that specific quality of command that isn't about loudness, but about being the person in a crisis that other people's eyes go to. Clara worked the bucket line with Miguel and 2 others, back and forth, the heat hitting her face in waves, smoke burning her eyes and throat. They saved the structure. Barely, and not without cost. The east wall was gone, and half the hayloft, and 2 of the stalls were unsalvageable. But the main frame held. The horses were out, scattered in the east pasture, most of them, all but one that Carver went after on foot and found 2 fields away. The cattle were untouched. When it was over, they stood in the yard in the smoke and the dark, and the particular exhausted silence of people who've done everything they could do and are now just accounting for what remains. Coulter stood at the edge of the ruin with ash on his face and his shirt dark with sweat, and something in his expression that Clara recognized. Not defeat, exactly. The thing before defeat, when you're still deciding if you're going to let it become that. She went and stood beside him. They looked at the burned wall, the collapsed hayloft, the dark framework of what had been standing yesterday. The smell of it was everywhere. wood smoke and ash and something almost earthy underneath. The smell of a thing that had been solid and was now changed. "It can be rebuilt," she said. He turned to look at her. "The frame's good," she said. "The structure held. Everything that burned can be rebuilt." She paused. "We can rebuild it." That word, "we," sat in the air between them. She felt him looking at her and she met it, and there in the gray pre-dawn light with smoke still rising from the wreckage, and both of them covered in ash and sweat, and the evidence of 2 hours of desperate work, something passed between them that she'd been careful around for weeks. He reached out and, very deliberately, took a piece of ash from her cheek. It was not a kiss. It was not a declaration. But it was not nothing, either. His thumb against her cheekbone, careful, and his eyes on hers, and neither of them looking away. "Yeah," he said quietly. "We can." She nodded, looked back at the barn. Her throat was raw and her arms ached, and she was going to have to start breakfast in 2 hours, and the whole ranch was going to need feeding, and she had absolutely no idea what the coming days were going to cost them in labor and material. She was also, despite everything, entirely sure she was in the right place. That was a new feeling. She was careful with it, but she let herself have it. The days after the fire had the quality of something stripped down to its essentials. No pretense, no careful distance, just work, and the people doing it, and the slow process of figuring out what remained and what needed replacing. The burned wall came down first, Coulter and Carver and Miguel with sledgehammers on a cold morning, pulling the compromised timber before it could fall on its own terms. Clara fed everyone. She kept the coffee hot and the meals regular, and she moved through the wreckage of the schedule the way she moved through most things, forward, steadily, without requiring the situation to be different than it was before she could function in it. Lily helped where she could and stayed out of the way where she couldn't, which was a skill not all adults had managed. And she watched everything with those careful eyes, and occasionally reported her assessments to Clara at bedtime with the seriousness of a small foreman reviewing the day's progress. "Carver says the east wall's going to be stronger than the old one," she said on the third night, Captain tucked under her arm. "He said the old lumber was half rotten anyway, and nobody noticed because the fire hadn't happened yet." "That's one way to find out," Clara said. "Papa was out there until it was too dark to see last night." Lily paused. "He does that when he's worried. Works until he can't anymore." Clara smoothed the blanket across Lily's lap. "He's not going to lose the ranch over this." "I know." Lily looked at her. "He's not worried about the ranch." Clara said nothing to that. Lily was 8, but 8-year-olds who'd grown up watching a parent closely develop perceptions that were often sharper than the adults around them wanted to credit. "Sleep," Clara said. "You didn't say I was wrong," Lily observed. "Sleep, Lily." Lily slept. Clara sat in the chair by the bed for a few minutes longer than she needed to, listening to the child's breathing even out, and thought about what it meant to be seen clearly by someone who had no reason to look away. 2 weeks after the fire, with the new east wall framed and half-planked, Coulter came to find her in the garden. She was turning the last of the cold season beds, breaking up the compacted soil with a hand fork, getting it ready for the spring plantings that were still months away, but that wouldn't happen if the ground wasn't prepared now. Her back was aching and her hands were cold, and she'd been thinking, not for the first time, about the conversation she and Coulter hadn't quite had yet, the one that had been building since the night at the burned barn, when he'd taken the ash from her cheek and said, "We like it was a thing he'd decided rather than a thing he'd let slip." She heard his footsteps in the dry grass and looked up. He stood at the garden's edge with his hat off, which she'd noticed was a thing he did when he was about to say something that mattered to him. The morning was gray, overcast in the flat way that Arizona sometimes managed in November, the light even and shadowless. "I need to say something," he said. She sat back on her heels and waited. "I'm aware of what the contract says," he started. He said it carefully, the way a man speaks when he's rehearsed an opening and is hoping the rest will follow. "I wrote it to protect you, not to—" He stopped, tried again. "I'm not going to use it as an excuse to be something I don't want to be." Clara looked at him. "What do you want to be?" The question landed and he didn't dodge it. "Honest with you," he said. "That's where I have to start." He turned his hat in his hands once. The tell she'd learned meant he was uncomfortable but committed to continuing anyway. "I think about you more than I should, given the situation. I notice you all the time. I noticed you before I had any right to, and I've been keeping that to myself because the contract exists, and because you didn't come here to have someone complicate your life further, and because—" he stopped. Because I didn't want you to feel like it was one more form of pressure from one more man with something over you. The wind moved through the dead garden stalks. A crow landed on the fence post at the garden's far end and regarded them both without interest. Clara looked at her hands, dirty from the soil, knuckles red from the cold. Real hands. Working hands. Hers. And now, she said, now I'm telling you because not telling you has started to feel like its own kind of dishonesty. He said it plainly. No performance in it, no calculated vulnerability. Just a man saying a difficult true thing because he decided it needed saying. You don't have to do anything with it. I'm not asking you to. She stood up, brushing the soil from her knees. She looked at him across the turned earth of the garden bed. This man she'd been watching for months, whom she'd learned to read the way you learn to read weather when it matters, who had sat in her room at 2 a.m. because a child asked him to, and had stayed because he'd wanted to. I'm not afraid of you, she said. I want you to know that. I've been careful, but it hasn't been fear. Something shifted in his face. What has it been? The contract, she said, and my own head, and learning the difference between something feeling safe and something actually being safe. She paused. I think I know the difference now. He looked at her for a long moment. The crow on the fence post made a sound and flew away. The contract comes down, he said. I want to take it to town and have it voided, before anything else. I'm not offering it as a trade. I just can't have it existing while we're... He gestured between them, not quite finishing the sentence. When? She said. Tomorrow, if you want. She nodded. Once, slowly, with the deliberateness of someone committing to a direction. All right, she said. He looked at her for another second, and then he put his hat back on and nodded back and walked towards the barn. And Clara stood in the cold garden and felt something she hadn't felt in recent memory, the specific, fragile weight of something beginning. They rode to Mill Haven the next morning, the nearest town with a county clerk's office, 14 miles east on a road that was better in summer than in November. Rosa watched Lily. The ride was quiet in the way that comfortable silences are, the two of them on their horses moving at an easy pace, the desert around them pale and dormant, the mountains to the west catching a flat white light. The county clerk was a precise, thin-faced man named Aldous Bream, who had the expression of someone who had seen every variety of human complication pass through his office and had learned to process them without editorial. He looked at the contract, looked at Coulter, looked at Clara, and asked the required questions with the brisk neutrality of his profession. You're voiding this of your own free will, Miss Mercer? No duress, no coercion? My own free will, Clara said. And you, Mr. Hayes, are releasing all claims under this contract without compensation effective today? Effective today, Coulter said. Bream stamped the document, wrote across it in large permanent ink, void, contract dissolved by mutual consent. He had both of them sign the notation, pressed his seal to it, and filed it in his cabinet with the efficiency of a man moving on to the next task. That was all it took. Clara stood in the clerk's office with the copy of the voided contract in her hands, and felt the absence of a weight she hadn't fully measured until it was gone. Not like a door swinging open, nothing so dramatic. More like something that had been pressing quietly against her chest for months had just stopped. She was free. Not in the way people use that word loosely, not metaphorically. Actually, legally, entirely. No owner, no obligation. No one with a paper claim on her time or her body or her future, just herself. She folded the voided contract carefully and put it in her jacket pocket. She was going to keep it. Not out of bitterness, not as evidence of anything. Just because it was the document that marked the first time she'd stood somewhere and been asked what she wanted and had it matter. They stepped out of the courthouse into the November street. The town of Mill Haven was moderate in its ambitions. A main street with a general store, a post office, a saloon on the corner that was doing modest business even at mid-morning, a smithy, a church at the far end. Not pretty, exactly, but solid. Built to last. Coulter stopped on the courthouse steps. The street was not busy, but it wasn't empty. He turned to look at her, and she could see him working through something, the hat off again, held at his side. I told you I wasn't asking anything, he said. I meant that. A pause. But I want to ask something now. She waited. Stay, he said. Not because of the ranch, not because of Lily, not because you don't have other options. He held her eyes. Because I can't think of a version of the next 20 years that I want to be in if you're not in it, and I needed to say that out loud where you could hear it and decide for yourself. The November wind came down the street and moved the dust around. From inside the saloon, someone laughed at something. Clara looked at this man. The bad knee, the lines on his face, the way he held his hat when he was saying something real, the dark circles he'd had for 2 weeks from working too late in the firelight. Not a simple man, not an easy one. The kind of person who had made mistakes and carried them and hadn't let them make him cruel, which was, she'd come to understand, rarer than it should be. "I'm not going anywhere," she said. He exhaled, slow and quiet. "Yeah? I've been staying because I wanted to," she said, "not because of the paper. The paper just made it complicated." She looked at him. "It's less complicated now." Something in his face eased. Not relaxed exactly, but like a thing held tense for a long time that had finally been allowed to be different. He reached over and took her hand, not dramatically, just picked it up and held it, and they stood on the courthouse steps in Mill Haven on a cold November morning and didn't say anything else for a moment. Then she said, "We need to get back. I told Rosa we'd be home by noon." "We'll make it." "Lily's going to ask what happened." "What are we going to tell her?" Clara thought about it. "The truth. That we went to town and handled some paperwork." He looked at her with the expression she'd come to know as his version of amusement. "She's going to ask follow-up questions." "She always does." They walked to their horses. They were 20 yards down the street when the voice came from the saloon doorway. "Hayes." Coulter slowed. Clara felt it before she turned, felt the change in his posture, the particular stillness of a man who has recognized something unpleasant. Victor Crow stood in the saloon doorway. He was not in the polished condition he'd arrived at Iron Mesa in. His jacket was wrinkled and his beard was less tidy, and there was a looseness in his bearing that read as a man who'd had several drinks before noon and had decided this was acceptable. Edwin Mercer was behind him, deeper in the doorway, and he had the look of a man who already knew this was a bad idea and didn't have the backbone to say so. "I heard you were in town," Crow said. He looked at Clara without greeting her. "Saw your horses outside the courthouse." His eyes went back to Coulter. "You void the contract." "That's county business," Coulter said, "not yours." "I made an offer." Crow's voice had the careful over-precision of the drunk trying to sound sober. "A fair offer. You turned it down. Fine, that's your right." He stepped down from the saloon step to the street level, and the move put him closer than was comfortable. But somebody ought to know, somebody in this town. That barn fire wasn't lightning, wasn't the season for it anyway. He said it with a strange, loose casualness, like a man who has been holding something and has decided, in the particular wisdom of alcohol, that holding it is overrated. Dry wood needs a little help sometimes to really get going. The street was not busy, but it was not empty. A man outside the post office had stopped. 2 women on the general store's porch were very still. Coulter took 1 step forward. His voice came out flat and quiet. "Say that again." Victor Crow looked at him. "I said dry wood needs help sometimes. I paid men who know how to help it." He smiled, the thin, stripped version of the polished smile he'd brought to Iron Mesa, with nothing behind it now. "You should have taken the deal, Hayes. Would have saved you a barn." The silence that followed had the quality of a held breath. Clara looked at Edwin Mercer in the doorway. He was staring at the saloon floor. Not surprised. He'd known. He'd come to Iron Mesa with this man. He'd sat on the steps while Crow made his offer. He'd ridden away when Clara said no. And somewhere between then and now, he'd either learned or suspected what Crow had done, and he'd said nothing. She felt something then. Not shock, because she was past being shocked by Edwin. Not quite grief, because she'd already done most of that grieving over years. Something more like finality. The last piece of an old story settling into its permanent position. Victor Crow was still looking at Coulter with that unhinged calmness, apparently believing that his money and his standing in Tucson made him untouchable even from his own confession. He was wrong about that. The sheriff's name was Tom Garrett, and he had been coming out of the post office when Crow started talking. He was a deliberate, unexcitable man in his late 50s who had been doing this job for a long time and had developed the particular quality of law enforcement that is more about presence than force. The sense that when he stood somewhere, the law stood there with him. He crossed the street at an unhurried pace and stopped beside Victor Crow. "Mr. Crow," he said, "I need you to come with me." Crow looked at him. The alcohol-loosened confidence in his face went through a rapid reassessment. Now, I heard what you were just, Garrett said. So did everyone on this street. He looked at his deputy, who'd appeared from somewhere. Tom, go get Edwin Mercer, too. Edwin didn't run. He just stood in the saloon doorway with the look of a man who'd made his choices and had finally arrived at the place those choices always led. Clara watched him being walked down the street toward the sheriff's office. She watched her father's back, the broad, diminished shoulders, the slow walk of a man who'd always chosen the easiest path available and had finally run out of easy paths. And she waited to feel something more than she was feeling. She felt tired. She felt old in a way that had nothing to do with her age. She felt the cold morning air on her face and the voided contract folded in her jacket pocket and Coulter's presence beside her, solid and still. Clara. His voice was quiet. She turned to face him. His expression was careful, checking her, not assuming. I'm all right, she said. You don't have to be. I know. She looked down the street at the retreating figures. I've been saying goodbye to him for years, in pieces. This is just the last piece. She paused. It doesn't hurt the way it used to. What does it do? She thought about it honestly. It just ends, she said. That's all. It just ends. He nodded. He didn't try to wrap it in anything better than it was, and she was grateful for that. Sheriff Garrett came back and took their statements, both of them, separately, which was professional and appropriate, and told them Crow would be charged with arson and destruction of property, and that Edwin's involvement would be determined by the investigation. He was measured and thorough, and Clara answered every question directly, and when it was done, she shook his hand and walked back to where the horses were tied. She untied her horse, checked the saddle, swung up and settled herself and looked down the main street of Mill Haven, at the courthouse where she'd stood an hour ago and watched a stamp come down on a document that used to mean something about her life and now meant it was over. Coulter mounted beside her. They turned their horses toward the road home. When we get back, Clara said, after a mile of quiet, Lily is going to know something happened. Yeah, Coulter said. She reads faces. She gets that from her mother, he said. A pause. The kind that acknowledges what's just been said and doesn't rush past it. Her mother was good at that too. Clara had never heard him volunteer anything about his wife before. She let the sentence breathe. She must have been something, Clara said carefully. She was, he said. She was difficult and funny, and she argued about everything and she died too young. He said it without particular weight, the way people say things that are simply true and have been true for long enough that the saying of them doesn't break anything anymore. She would have liked you, he added. She had no patience for people who weren't straight with her. She would have liked how straight you are. Clara looked at the road ahead. The mountains were visible now, the western range with its flat November light, the desert spreading out in every direction with its spare, honest beauty. I'd like to hear about her sometime, Clara said. If you want to tell me. Sometime, he said. Yeah, they rode the rest of the way home in a silence that was not empty. That was in fact full of the kind of things that don't need to be said immediately because they found a place to rest, a ground to settle into, the quiet understanding that there was time now. That time was something they had. Lily met them at the gate, as she always did when they'd been gone, with Captain under her arm and the expression of someone who'd been waiting with patience. She'd assembled specifically for this occasion and was ready to disassemble now that they were back. She looked at their faces. Clara saw her reading them, quick, accurate, 8 years old, and already better at it than most adults. What happened? Lily said. We handled some paperwork, Clara said, swinging down from her horse. Lily looked at her father. What kind of paperwork? Coulter took his horse's reins and didn't quite suppress what Clara had learned to recognize as his version of a smile. The good kind, he said. Lily looked between them for a moment, conducting her assessment. Then she said, with the certainty of a child who has reached a conclusion and sees no reason to elaborate. Okay. And she turned and walked back toward the house, Captain bouncing under her arm. Clara caught Coulter's eye over the back of her horse. He shrugged, just slightly. She almost laughed. She brought her horse to the stable and began unsaddling her, going through the familiar motions of it. The buckles, the weight of the saddle, the horse's warm smell, and the hay dust air of the stable. And she thought about the day from the beginning to the end of it. The courthouse, the voided stamp, the street, her father's back, the road home. She put her hand against her horse's flank and felt the animal warmth of it, steady and indifferent and alive. She was 20 years old. She was free. She was standing in the stable of a ranch that was not hers by contract or by claim, but was hers by every measure that actually meant something, by work and choice, and the slow, undramatic accumulation of days that add up to a life. She had a room with a latch that worked. She had a child who saved her a seat at every meal. She had a man who'd taken a stamp to a piece of paper because he refused to let it exist between them. And she had, in her jacket pocket, a folded document that said void across it in permanent ink, the record of the first time someone with power over her had chosen to give it up. She finished with this horse, walked out of the stable into the last of the afternoon light. Smoke was coming from the kitchen chimney. Somewhere inside she could hear Rose's voice and Lily's voice arguing cheerfully about something, the everyday music of a house with people in it. She went inside. Winter came to Iron Mesa the way it always did. Not with the dramatic fury of places that get real snow, but with a slow, bone-deep cold that settled into the desert floor and stayed there, and a gray quality to the light that made the days feel shorter than they were. The burned east wall of the barn was fully rebuilt by December, the new lumber still pale against the weathered gray of the older sections, obvious as a scar and just as honest. Coulter had decided not to try to match it. New wood was new wood. There was no point pretending otherwise. Clara thought that was the right call, though she didn't say so out loud. Some things didn't need commentary. The weeks after Millhaven settled into a new kind of ordinary, different from the careful ordinary of before, when she and Coulter had both been navigating around something unnamed and she'd been checking the latch on her door more from habit than necessity. This was quieter, more like ground than water. She still did the same work, the kitchen, the garden beds in their winter sleep, Lily's reading and letters, and the ongoing education of Captain the Rabbit in matters of indoor comportment. But she did it without the low-level vigilance she'd been running since Red Canyon, that constant background process of measuring distances and exits and the moods of the people around her. She caught herself noticing its absence, the way you notice when a sound you've lived with for years finally stops. Victor Crow's trial was set for February in the county seat. The sheriff sent word that both Clara and Coulter would be called to testify, which they expected and prepared for. What came as mild surprise was a letter. Arriving in December, addressed to Clara in handwriting she recognized immediately and had complicated feelings about, from Edwin Mercer. She read it at the kitchen table in the morning before anyone else was up, with coffee she'd made for herself and the winter dark still pressed against the window. It was not a good letter in the sense of being well written or emotionally coherent. It was a rambling, defensive thing, full of qualifications and almost apologies that kept veering into explanations that were really justifications in disguise. Edwin wrote that he hadn't known Crow was going to burn the barn when he agreed to bring him to Iron Mesa. He wrote that things had gotten out of his control. He wrote, once, the words "I'm sorry," buried in the middle of a sentence that immediately softened it with, "but you have to understand." He wrote that the county was being hard on him, and he hoped she would speak on his behalf at the proceeding. Clara read it twice. She set it down on the table and looked at it for a while. Then she got up and put it in the iron stove and watched it go. She told Coulter that evening briefly, not making much of it. He listened and asked if she was all right. She said yes, and meant it in a way that felt different from the automatic yes she'd deployed for years as a shield. This was a genuine assessment. She was all right. Not undamaged, not without history, not operating without the understanding of what her father was and had always been, but all right. Standing on her own feet, clear-eyed about what deserved grief and what deserved simply to be released. "I'm not going to speak for him," she said, "at the trial. No one expects you to." "He'll expect me to." She paused. "He still thinks that's how it works, that I owe him that much." Coulter looked at her across the dinner table, the remnants of the meal between them, Lily already in bed, the house quiet around them. "What do you think you owe him?" She considered it honestly. "Nothing," she said. "I think I'm done with owing him anything. Not out of spite, just—" She searched for the right word and found it. "Accounting. Honest accounting of what was given and what was taken and what's left." He nodded. He understood accounting. The trial came in February on a cold, clear week when the desert was at its starkest and most honest. All pale rock and gray scrub, and a sky so blue it seemed aggressive about it. They rode to the county seat with Carver, who came along as a matter of straightforward loyalty, and spent the journey being ostentatiously uncurious about the nature of the proceedings. Victor Crow had engaged a lawyer from Tucson, which was his right, And the lawyer was good enough to make the 2-day proceeding more complicated than it should have been. He questioned timelines. He questioned the reliability of witnesses who'd been standing in a street where a man was drinking. He suggested that words spoken in obvious distress couldn't be reliably interpreted as confession. Clara testified on the second morning. She sat in the witness chair and answered every question without elaboration, but without evasion either. And she was aware of Victor Crow watching her from the defendant's table with the flat, recalibrating look of a man who'd expected her to be smaller than she was. She wasn't performing for him. She was just answering questions. She'd stopped performing for men who wanted her diminished a while back. Coulter testified after her, and he had the quality in that chair that he had everywhere, a steadiness that didn't require anyone to look at it to be felt, the kind that made the lawyer's attempts at unsettling him visibly futile. Edwin was tried separately on a lesser charge, being party to a conspiracy, the sheriff having determined that his involvement in the arson itself was limited to knowing and not reporting. The distinction mattered legally even when it felt thin in practice. Clara was not called to testify in her father's trial. She sat in the public gallery and watched him sit at his own table, looking older than the last time she'd seen him, the defensive architecture of his usual expression gone and replaced by something that was either genuine remorse or very good fatigue. She couldn't be sure and decided it didn't matter. He looked at her once, across the room. She held it. She didn't look away, and she didn't fill her expression with anything for him to read. After a moment, he looked away first. Victor Crow was convicted of arson and destruction of property. He was sentenced to 4 years and stripped of the business licenses he'd held in the territory. The lawyer appealed immediately, which meant it would drag on, but the conviction stood and the sentence would hold, the sheriff told them afterward, confident in the appellate court's view of the evidence. Edwin received 60 days and a significant fine. Coulter found her outside the courthouse afterward, standing in the February cold with her arms crossed and her face tilted up toward the sky. He came and stood beside her without saying anything, which was one of the things she'd grown genuinely appreciative of, his understanding of when words didn't improve a moment. She let out a slow breath, visible in the cold air. "It's done," she said. "It's done," he agreed. They stood there for another minute. Then she uncrossed her arms and said, "I want to go home." He looked at her when she said home. Just a look. But she caught it, and she meant it, and he knew she meant it, and that was enough. Spring came back to Iron Mesa the way it always did. Quietly, insistently, without announcement. The garden beds woke up. The cattle moved differently, with the particular purpose of animals that feel warmth returning. Lily went through a phase of wanting to be outside from sunup to dark, which had to be negotiated around her continued education, a negotiation that Lily approached as though it were a legal matter requiring precedent and counter-argument. "I learn more outside," she told Clara on an April morning, with Captain held in front of her like supporting evidence. "You learn more outside about things that are outside," Clara said. "Your arithmetic doesn't improve by proximity to the garden." Lily considered this. What if we did arithmetic about the garden? Like how many rows, how many seeds? Sit down. Lily sat down. But she looked pleased with herself in the way of someone who knows they haven't won the argument but has lodged their position effectively. Clara looked at this child, 9 years old now, taller than 3 months ago, losing the last of the round-faced babyhood in the emerging angles of whoever she was becoming, and felt something that she'd stopped trying to categorize. It wasn't maternal exactly, because Clara was 20 years old, and the word felt too large and too formal for what they actually were to each other. It was simpler than that. It was what it was when you showed up consistently for someone small, and they showed up for you in the ways they had available, and the cumulative weight of that became something real. Coulter asked her to marry him on an evening in May. Not with ceremony, not with kind of stage setting that stories sometimes arrange around such moments. He asked her the way he did most things that mattered to him, directly, without a lot of decoration, with his hat off and his eyes on her face. They were sitting on the back porch after supper, Lily long since in bed, the desert evening doing its particular slow darkening trick, where the sky stayed light longer than it had any reason to. He'd been quiet for a while in the specific way she'd learned meant he was working up to something. Not because he was afraid of her answer, but because he took the saying of important things seriously and wanted to say it right. "I've been thinking," he said, which was the beginning of a lot of his important sentences. "I know," she said. He looked at her sideways. You can tell? You get quiet in a particular way. She kept her eyes on the desert. You've been building up to something for about a week. I was quiet for another moment, accepting this assessment. Then, my wife's ring is in the box in my top drawer. It's been there since she died, and I didn't know what to do with it. Whether it was right to keep it or wrong. Whether it belonged to that part of my life only. He paused. I'd like you to have it, if you want it. That's the question. Clara turned to look at him. He met her eyes, and there was something in his face that she'd only ever seen in pieces before. Fully visible now, unguarded. The face of a man who was not trying to manage how much she saw. He had a dead wife he'd loved. He had a daughter who'd been afraid of the dark for 3 years. He had a ranch that had nearly burned and had been rebuilt and bore the marks of both. He was 41 years old and tired in some ways, and not tired in others, and he was looking at her on a porch in the May evening, asking her a question that he could not take back. She would have given it, he said quietly. I know that sounds like a thing a person says, but I knew her. She would have said, give it to someone who deserves it. He looked at his hands. I think you deserve it. Clara was quiet for a moment. She thought about the question underneath the question, not just will you marry me, but can you accept something that comes with history, with grief, with a man who will never be entirely uncomplicated, who has a past that doesn't disappear just because a new thing is beginning. She thought about her own history, the shack in Red Canyon, the years of making herself small, the fever and the voided contract and her father's letter burning in the stove, the things she'd carried and the things she'd put down and the things she was still, honestly, working through. I'm not easy either, she said. I want you to know that. I've got things in me that are going to take time. I'm not a fixed thing. I'm still working on some of it. I know that, he said. It doesn't scare you off. No, he said simply. It doesn't. She looked at him for a long moment. Then she said, yes, I'd like the ring. He nodded. The way he'd nodded when she'd said all right at the garden fence months ago. The nod of a man who's heard something important and is holding it carefully. I'll get it, he said. Not tonight, she said. Tonight I just want to sit here. So they sat there. The desert went from purple to dark blue to black, and the stars came out the way they did in Arizona, not gradually, but suddenly, like a decision. Soot came and lay at the porch's edge with his chin on his paws. The cattle made their distant sounds. The rebuilt barn stood at the edge of the yard, its new east wall visible even in the dark, pale lumber against old. They didn't hold hands. They didn't say anything else. They just sat in the same space as people who have made a decision and don't need to keep confirming it. They married in the rebuilt barn in September. It was not elegant. Clara would say that later and mean it as a compliment. Rosa had done what she could with dried flowers and lanterns, and Lily had insisted on scattering actual wildflowers down the makeshift aisle. She'd spent a week collecting them from the desert with a dedication that suggested Captain might have been involved in the logistical planning. The ring was old silver, simple, slightly worn in the way of things that had been worn before with love and were being worn again with love, a continuity that Clara found she didn't mind at all. There was a justice of the peace from Mill Haven, a man named Briggs, who was clearly moved by the occasion in a way he was trying to be professional about, and failing slightly. There were the ranch hands, even Dale Sutter, who had made himself quietly useful in the barn rebuild, and had been less of a problem in the months since, as men sometimes become when they discover that the world doesn't actually reorganize around their opinions. There was Rosa, who cried through the whole thing and was unapologetic about it. Lily walked beside Clara, not giving her away. Nobody was giving anyone to anyone, which was a point Clara had been clear about when the ceremony was being planned. Just walking beside her, because she'd asked to, and because it was right. When Briggs asked Clara if she took this man, she said yes, and she meant it, and it was the clearest yes she'd ever said in her life. She'd said yes to a lot of things over the years because no was not available to her. This was different. This was yes built from a full inventory of available options and a deliberate choice among them. That difference was everything. After, the ranch celebrated with the kind of organized chaos that happens when people who work hard together get an evening of permission to stop. Music came from somewhere. Miguel had a guitar, and a hand named James had a fiddle, and neither of them was technically accomplished, but both of them were enthusiastic, and the result was loud and energetic and imprecise in all the ways that made it feel human. Lily danced until Rosa physically removed her from the floor and pointed her at bed, and then appeared again 20 minutes later, and Rosa removed her again with less patience. Coulter danced exactly once, with Clara, and he was not graceful about it, and she was not graceful about it either, and they both knew it and neither cared. "This is not my strong suit," he said. "I'd worked that out," she said. "You're not doing much better." "I know." She stepped on his foot. He absorbed it without comment. They kept moving. Years passed. Not in a blur. That's the story's version of time, the way it gets compressed and called a blur, when really it's just years, each one made of days that were individual and specific, and full of the unglamorous particulars of a life actually being lived. Bad harvests and good ones. A winter that was hard enough to lose 4 head of cattle. A spring that was good enough to recover them, and more. Lily going from 9 to 12 to 15, each version of her recognizable and new, the dark-eyed, serious child becoming a dark-eyed, serious young woman with her father's jaw, and her mother's. Coulter said this quietly, once, on a summer evening watching Lily walk across the yard. Her mother's particular way of moving through a room like she'd already decided what she thought about it. Rosa's back got bad enough that she stepped back from the heavy cooking by the time Lily was 12, and she moved into a smaller role that suited her dignity and her actual capacity, and Clara adjusted the kitchen work without making it into a thing that required acknowledgement. Rosa would sometimes sit at the kitchen table in the mornings and tell stories about cooking for families in Santa Fe when she was young, and Clara would listen while she worked, and that arrangement suited both of them well. Carver retired. Miguel's nephew came to work at the ranch and turned out to be better with horses than anyone they'd ever had, which improved several things at once. Dale Sutter left of his own accord on decent terms, which was better than anyone had predicted, and the hand who replaced him was a woman named Patrice, who had ridden up to the gate one morning looking for work, and had been hired on the strength of the same principle Clara herself had arrived on, that a person's willingness to show up and do the work was the relevant information, and most other things sorted themselves out from there. Clara did not think often about Red Canyon. When she did, it was not with the specific, pressing quality of something unresolved, but more with the distant, neutral quality of geography. A place she'd been, a road she'd come from, a set of coordinates that had been the start of a long walk that had ended somewhere entirely different. She thought sometimes about her mother, who had sat with her through a fever when she was 7, and then died and left her alone in that shack with a man who'd been diminishing before the loss, and had finished the job afterward. She thought about what her mother might have made of the life Clara was living now. She hoped it would have been something. She'd never know, and she'd made her peace with not knowing, and that was as much resolution as that particular thing was ever going to offer. Edwin served his 60 days and disappeared somewhere south. Word came through Millhaven eventually, months later, that he'd gone to Mexico, which was neither surprising nor particularly interesting. Clara noted it, let it settle, and moved on. Victor Crow's appeal failed. He served his sentence, and the territory was quieter for it. On an October evening, many years after the fire, after the rebuilt barn had itself acquired the weathered gray of time, so that the pale new east wall was no longer distinguishable from the rest of it, everything worn down to the same honest color by the same Arizona sun. Coulter and Clara sat on the back porch as they often did in the evenings. Lily was in Tucson studying, writing letters home every 2 weeks with the particular intensity of someone who has discovered that the world is both larger and more manageable than they'd expected. Soot had died 4 years back, peacefully, as good dogs sometimes manage, and his replacement, a young, foolish cattle dog named Pepper, who had not yet learned that undignified enthusiasm was a phase and not a personality, was currently asleep against the porch railing with his legs in the air. The desert was doing its evening thing. Coulter reached over and took Clara's hand the same way he had 1,000 times, the gesture worn smooth and easy with use, a thing that had stopped being deliberate and become simply what his hand did when she was next to him. She was 32 years old. She had a scar on her left palm from a kitchen accident she'd never quite gotten the full story straight on. She still read every night. She still checked that her room, their room, latch worked. Not out of fear anymore, but out of a habit that had transformed from vigilance to a small private ritual, the daily acknowledgement of a door that opened and closed on her terms. She was not a simple person, and she was not entirely healed of everything that had happened to her, And she was not living some version of her life that bore no relationship to the 19-year-old who'd ridden out of Red Canyon in the burning desert sun with 3 books wrapped in cloth and no reason to trust anything. She was instead the person that 19-year-old had slowly become, with effort and time and stubbornness and the specific grace of having found a few people worth staying for. Lily wrote, she said, she's thinking about law. Coulter absorbed this. Law. She argues about everything. It makes sense. He was quiet for a moment, and she could feel him somewhere between proud and amused, which was his default state regarding his daughter. She'll be formidable, he said. She already is, Clara said. They sat a while. The stars arrived doing their sudden Arizona thing. She thought, not for the first time and not heavily, about the nature of what they'd built together. Not the ranch, though the ranch was part of it, but the less visible thing, the structure underneath. The trust that had been assembled piece by piece over years of showing up and meaning what you said and not expecting the other person to be something they weren't. There was nothing heroic about it. That was the thing people sometimes got wrong about stories like this. They looked for the dramatic turning point, the moment of rescue, and thought that was the thing. The fire, the courthouse, the ring. But those were just the visible moments. The real thing was smaller and repeated and daily, the coffee made before she'd asked for it. The chair pulled to her bedside at 2 a.m. The word we spoken in the ash and the smoke. A man turning his hat in his hands because he was saying something real and wanted to say it right. It was 2 wounded people choosing each other, yes. But more accurately, it was 2 wounded people choosing each other on an ordinary Tuesday, and then choosing again on Wednesday, and then again and again, not because they were perfect, or because the choosing was always easy, but because the choosing itself was the point. That was the whole point. Not arrival, not the moment where everything was resolved and the music played and the story ended neatly. Just the ongoing, imperfect, entirely human act of deciding, again, that this was where you wanted to be. Clara leaned slightly against Coulter's shoulder. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. Pepper the dog made a small sound in his sleep and rolled over, and the desert went on being enormous and indifferent and beautiful in the dark. And the light in the rebuilt barn burned steady against the night, the way it always did. And the stars above Iron Mesa Ranch were the same stars that had hung over Red Canyon all those years ago, when a girl had ridden away from everything she'd known with 3 books and no certainties, except that she was still breathing, and that was enough to start. It had been enough. She had made it enough. That was the whole story, and it was hers, and no one had given it to her. She had built it herself, out of the only materials available, whatever she had left after everything that had been taken, and the people worth building with, and the daily, unglamorous, entirely necessary choice to keep going. That was all. That was everything.